please visit my website, programtokill.net. Go to plans and prices for even more exclusive information. You can also support me now on Patreon. Add me on TikTok. And leave a like and comment.
Scout Troop 137. New Orleans is one of the most cosmopolitan, yet picturesque, cities of the South. Sprawling along a crescent of the Mississippi River, a mere 110 miles northwest of the Gulf of Mexico, it is an important port and a major center of commerce, with a busy petrochemical industry, a NASA spaceflight facility, and flourishing tourism. Tourism annually contributes nearly $2 billion to the city's economy. People from around the world flock to the French Quarter with its colorful courtyards, unique ironwork, overhanging balconies, and an architectural blend of French, Spanish, neoclassic, and Victorian houses built flush with the street. Historians talk proudly of the Battle of New Orleans when Andrew Jackson led a ragtag band of Louisiana militia, Kentucky and Tennessee Long Riflemen, and Barataria pirates to a victory over the British in the War of 1812. But there is another, more sinister, side to the history of New Orleans. There are the fires, hurricanes, and annual plagues of yellow fever of the early years. Curiosity persists about Storyville, the notorious red light district where prostitution was legal for 2 decades around the turn of the century, and where many of the early jazz artists first worked professionally in whorehouses as musicians. The history of prostitution in New Orleans is as old as the city itself, hopelessly intertwined with the community's early affairs. Many of the first white women in the community were prostitutes, thieves, or other so-called fallen women rounded up in Europe and shipped to the New World. Long before the heyday of Storyville, which served sailors, fishermen, riverboat crews, and all sorts of womenless men from 1897 until 1917, New Orleans supported a series of red light districts such as Basin Street and the Swamp, as well as thousands of freelancing bawds who lurked in the murky light of gas lamps. Hordes of prostitutes from across the country flocked to New Orleans following Jackson's troops. Most of them stayed. When missionaries urged an early governor, Antoine de la Mothe Cadillac, to expel loose women from Louisiana during the early 18th century, he refused. There would be no females left, he responded. Not everyone in New Orleans is proud of the loose-steer aspects of the city's early history. The desire to repress information about that facet of New Orleans was so overpowering at one time that newspapers and periodicals in the public library were vandalized. Stories someone apparently considered bad for the city's image were clipped and destroyed. The city's oldest newspaper, the Times-Picayune, discarded files of photographs in 1938 and in the 1940s, and the city council changed the names of some of Storyville's streets. But censoring old newspaper reports of New Orleans' licentious history of prostitution did nothing to prevent a new sex scandal from erupting in the late 1970s. The scandal broke when police learned that a band of pederasts had wormed its way into leadership of a Boy Scout troop. The plotters exploited their position of trust to launch and operate a sophisticated scheme to seduce and use scouts and other young boys in a wide-ranging child prostitution and pornography operation. Boy prostitution was not new to the city. In the brawling, robust days of turn-of-the-century New Orleans, boys were easily procured for men with a lust for children of their own sex. At least one bawdy house was staffed with young boys in drag. But authorities were more tolerant then, and the operators were content to serve strictly a local clientele. The men who ran Troop 137 in the 1970s provided boys to wealthy pederasts and maintained connections with procurers and pornographers in other parts of Louisiana and in other states. Police smashed the operation after an employee of a photo processing studio noticed that some of the snapshots being developed were of men and a young boy locked in naked embraces and engaging in lurid sexual activities. One photograph showed a young boy performing oral sex on a man. In another, the features of the teenager were contorted in fear and pain as a man bent over him, and performed anal intercourse. The studio owner telephoned the police. Investigators quickly pinpointed Richard Halverson as the owner of the film. Obtaining a warrant to search the home of the 50-year-old New Orleans man, a volunteer probation officer and scoutmaster of Troop 137, they impounded a file cabinet full of names, addresses, and pornographic photos of nude men and boys engaged in sex acts. Some of the material implicated other pederasts, some from as far away as Saudi Arabia. It was apparent to the veteran police team that the New Orleans-based operation had tentacles that spread to more than a half-dozen other major American cities, among them Coral Gables, Florida. A handsome, bustling city of clean, palm-lined streets and some 45,000 to 50,000 citizens, Coral Gables is a residential community, popular winter resort, and the home of the University of Miami. It is not the sort of city that usually figures prominently in Federal Bureau of Investigation uniform crime reports, or that draws national attention for its violence or sex scandals. Yet events there had provided the first hints of an operation involving interstate pornography and prostitution of boys. It was midsummer of 1976 when a woman reported to officers in the New Orleans Police Department's Juvenile Division that she was suspicious of the Adelphi Academy in Coral Gables, which her son had attended on a scholarship. She had no proof, but provided officers with a list of names of adults her son said took sexual advantage of him. Peter Bradford, the school principal, was one. Bradford's friend, Robert Lang, was another. Lang had recently moved to New Orleans where another friend lived. That friend was Richard Halverson. New Orleans police immediately checked Halverson's background. His credentials were impeccable. He appeared to be a man dedicated to helping young people, a shaper of character, and an understanding father figure who worked earnestly with Boy Scouts and parolees who looked to him as a role model. State authorities also ran a check on Halverson, and again he came up clean. Then the photo studio reported the obscene pictures. Ironically, while police initially believed Halverson to be a Bedrock citizen, suspicions of Florida authorities had earlier led them to official contact with him. Gathering information about a foster parent named John Douglas who was suspected of having abused his wards, state investigators turned up Halverson's name. They wrote to him, asking about Douglas' character. Halverson responded with a glowing tribute, describing Douglas as a highly regarded, upstanding individual who was a pillar of the community. Much later it was learned that John Douglas was an alias used by Halverson. Shortly after Halverson was taken into custody, two other local scout leaders were arrested, Harold Woodall and Harry O. Cramer, both assistant scoutmasters. Cardboard boxes full of vile examples of chicken porn were confiscated. Some were so unbelievably filthy that hardened policemen shook their heads in disgust. There were photographs of men and boys engaging in sex with each other and with animals, and of men manacled with handcuffs and leather straps, or with rings piercing their nipples and penises. Some of the photos were of teenage residents of Boys Farm in Tennessee. But the most jarring of all was a set of pictures of a man crouched on all fours as a companion jammed a fist into his rectum nearly up to the elbow. Stacked with the photos were magazines listing young boys who were available as prostitutes in various cities. One publication from Titusville, located about midway along Florida's Atlantic coast, advertised 200 boys. Other Florida cities were pinpointed, including Coral Gables and Miami, but clearly the tentacles also extended to Boston, Los Angeles, Chicago, and to smaller communities in Michigan and Tennessee. Investigators began identifying the men and boys in the photos. New arrests were made. The son of the woman who had originally approached New Orleans police about the school in Coral Gables was questioned. Soon police had two boys, 11 and 13, who told of being sexually abused by scout leaders in New Orleans, and later at the private school they were transported to in Coral Gables. Lieutenant Charles Rodriguez telephoned the Coral Gables Police Department to ask about the Adelphi Academy, explaining that, after returning home to New Orleans, two former students had reported that they were anally raped and forced by the principal and other adults to perform oral sex. Sergeant S.T. Spooner took the call and was momentarily taken aback. He knew the school. It was less than a block from police department headquarters. It had both state and county approval and focused its services on boys with learning disabilities or other problems that resulted in poor performance in public schools. The academy had other facilities in Dade County, as well as one in Tampa. The school had been experiencing some financial difficulties, but there had been no hint of anything improper occurring there. Spooner asked for more information. Within 48 hours, he and his partner, Sergeant Anthony Raimondo, were looking over statements from the two former Adelphi students and their parents, and sifting through a handful of mug shots of men arrested in the probe by New Orleans police. Before nightfall, Spooner and Raimondo were disembarking from an airplane in New Orleans. Detective Frank Wykes met them and drove them to headquarters. If the two Coral Gables policemen still had lingering doubts about the gravity of the case, those doubts were dispelled when Wykes showed them the photographs and other confiscated material at the station. The host detectives gave Spooner and Raimondo some time to look over the pictures and printed matter, then turned to the information about activities of the gang in Coral Gables. The sworn statement of the 13-year-old was incriminating. The youngster had not needed any prompting. He was old enough to realize that he had been exploited, and he was angry. He wanted revenge, and he talked freely. The child said that Cramer was the first person who sexually abused him. As Cramer was giving him a ride one night, they drove to the scout leader's apartment. When they were inside, the scout leader made him take off his pants and perform a homosexual act. Several days later, the 13-year-old was introduced at a scout meeting to Halverson and Woodall. He said that after the meeting, he was driven to Halverson's home and forced to perform oral sex on both men. Later, still another scout leader took him to a motel and forced him to submit to anal intercourse. With permission of the parents, the officers from the Coral Gables Youth Resource Unit talked with both boys. They learned that Halverson had approached the parents and suggested that their sons begin attending scout meetings. In his capacity as a volunteer probation officer, Halverson had apparently learned that the boys were both from extremely poor families and were having difficulties in school. Involvement in scouting would presumably improve their behavior. It sounded good to the parents. They were flattered and relieved that a busy, important man like Halverson would show such interest in their sons. It seemed reasonable to expect that membership in Scouts would benefit the boys, and they were enrolled in Troop 137 with full parental blessings. Halverson seemed to develop a genuine fondness for the pair. When he approached the parents sometime later to suggest that the boys enter a private school in Florida, he had no trouble obtaining approval. He promised to arrange for full scholarships and provide transportation. There would be no cost whatsoever to the families. Raimondo later concluded that Halverson recruited at least 4 other boys from New Orleans for Adelphi the same way. Halverson and a friend, Richard A. Paske, were eventually accused of affiliating themselves with community volunteer agencies working with troubled boys to recruit prostitutes and models for pornography. They sometimes gave the boys presents, including guitars and motorcycles. The older boys subsequently told the Coral Gables detectives that Bradford paid for their plane fare to Florida. He also supplied high school certification documents costing $150 a set for the boys. Once the youths arrived in Coral Gables, the boys said he, his friend, and several youths lived with Bradford and attended school at Adelphi. All the boys were forced at different times to perform oral sex on their host and were anally sodomized. If they objected, they were beaten, sometimes with a belt. The horror stories mounted. Boys told of having telephone calls between them and their relatives monitored at the academy. If the boys appeared ready to complain of sexual or other abuse, a member of the staff would break in or cut off the call. One boy reported that he was once driven to a gay beach in the Florida Keys, tied naked facing a coconut palm, and repeatedly raped. The older of the 2 New Orleans boys filled more than 2 pages of testimony, with single-spaced accounts of beatings and sexual abuse suffered at the hands of the school principal. He also provided the names of 2 other victims and the nickname, Scotty, of an older boy whom he saw sodomized. Spooner and Raimondo were disgusted but determined as they returned home. Both men were already feeling the thrill of the hunt. It was obvious now that a far-reaching, sophisticated operation had been uncovered with Coral Gables at the center. Raimondo was appalled. Despite his experience in the police department, he had never before been exposed to such vile examples of sexual perversion. Evidence that the perversions were being forced on hapless children infuriated him. The father of a young man in a seminary and of an 8-year-old son, he was so upset that one of the first things he did when he returned home was to run background checks on the adult leaders of all activities his youngest son was participating in. No one would object if they had nothing to hide, he reasoned. The police sergeant need not have worried about his son. But the experience enabled him to develop tips that he continues to offer to other parents for protecting their children. They are: always be suspicious if youth leaders pay excessive attention to one child, especially if he asks if the child may go first to a public event and later to a private affair, such as an overnight camping trip. Beware if children of one sex frequent an adult's house and children of the opposite sex are never seen there. Looks are deceiving, and it is impossible to detect a child molester on sight. But there are certain types of boys who attract predators. They are usually light-complexioned, fair-haired, slender youths. Boys like Scotty. Raimondo was puzzled over the identity of the boy, Scotty, whom the New Orleans youth had remembered. And he was certain that somewhere he had also heard of Robert Lang, one of the men his brother officers in New Orleans had implicated in the child sex ring. Scrutinizing records in the Youth Resource Unit, Raimondo came up with the full name, Scott Edward Baker. The boy had been involved in the department's juvenile rehabilitation system for about 8 years, from the time he was 9 years old. He was from a poor but hard-working and honest family. Perhaps they were too hard-working, because his parents were unable to keep him from drifting into a series of minor scrapes with authorities over truancy and curfew violations. He was never accused of an actual crime. Nevertheless, social workers had decided that he could be better cared for in foster homes than with his natural parents. He was placed for a time in a foster home, then transferred to Boys Town, a Catholic home in southern Dade County for wayward boys. At Boys Town, he was listed for adoption, but he rebelled and was moved to another foster home. The history of his treatment while he was a ward of the state from that point on illustrates incredible carelessness on the part of authorities, according to the account of his experiences which he eventually related to Sergeant Raimondo. When he was 14, he was sent to stay with a bachelor who lived by himself on a yacht. The foster father seduced him. 3 months later, his sex education already begun, Scotty was returned to the Parkway Children's Home. After 2 days, he was sent to another foster home, where he lived for a month before being returned to the wealthy yacht owner. The boy was ashamed of submitting to his foster parent earlier and resisted his advances. But after several weeks of living in such close quarters with the man, he gave in again. After forced sex, Scotty cried. Finally, he was once more returned to the Parkway, and his sex education took a new turn. When he was raped by a black counselor, Scotty reached his breaking point. After the initial rape, he gave up and meekly submitted. The sexual assaults became a regular part of his life at Parkway. The counselor eventually began taking Scotty home to spend the night, and other employees talked admiringly of their colleague's dedication and the personal interest he was taking in the boy's rehabilitation. Scotty was finally placed with another foster parent, a man already known to police as a habitual sex offender. Somehow the boy survived, and after several months convinced a social worker that he was old enough to take care of himself. He was finally permitted to return to his natural parents. A few weeks later, he had found himself a girlfriend and obtained a job with a company engaged in research with tropical fish. As soon as Raimondo located Scotty, he gave instructions to have the boy brought into the police department for a talk. Then he stepped up his search for Lang and put out a pickup order for Bradford, the former principal of Adelphi. Bradford had left his job in Coral Gables inches ahead of the police. The academy was sold to new, legitimate owners, who assumed management just in time to reap the hurricane of bad publicity that blew up with the demise of Scout Troop 137 and the search for Bradford, Lang, and their co-conspirators. A few hours after the pickup orders were issued for Bradford, Raimondo was informed by fellow investigators that neither Bradford nor Lang could be found. Speaking with Lang's former neighbors, police learned that he was well thought of. He had a good job with the U.S. Postal Service and appeared to be honest, and a steady worker. No one could understand why he had left his home so abruptly. One woman pointed out that his reputation was so spotless that he had been certified by the state of Florida as a foster parent. There was every reason to believe that he was exactly what he appeared to be, a good neighbor and a kind, community-spirited man who took troubled boys into his home. Raymondo hit the ceiling when he learned that Lang was a foster parent. The information was confirmed at the Division of Family Services in the Florida Department of Health and Rehabilitation Services. Lang complied with the standards established by city, county, and state authorities. He had good credentials. Before moving to Florida, he was a policeman in Oregon. Seeking Bradford, Raymondo and his partner learned that he had worked briefly for a steamship line catering service in Miami, but was fired after smuggling a young boy aboard a cruise ship. After that, he dropped completely out of sight. But Scotty Baker was located at the fish research firm where he worked and willingly came to police headquarters for the talk with Youth Resource Unit officers. He was neatly dressed and courteous, and he impressed his listeners with his behavior as he told his story to Raymondo and Spooner. The youngster allowed his voice to drop only a few times while recounting some of the most embarrassing incidents. By the time he was finished, Raymondo and his partner were staring at each other in amazement, shaken at the abuse inflicted on the slender, good-looking youth and at the casual manner in which foster parents were selected. It seemed that everywhere the investigation turned, another foster father was found who sexually abused the young boys put in his charge. Talking with the youth, Raymondo learned that Scotty's first foster father had been an intelligence officer in the U.S. Army, a former employee of the Central Intelligence Agency, had authored a half-dozen books, and was a successful businessman in Coral Gables. He was obviously a man who could be a formidable enemy. Raymondo was not intimidated. He proceeded to build a case against the aberrant foster parent and against the other man Scotty had named. The boy submitted to the examination by polygraph, and his story was verified. Information was prepared for a grand jury. The grand jury never considered the evidence. A telephone call from the Dade County morgue brought Raymondo and Spooner the most shocking and depressing news of their investigation. Scotty Baker was dead. He had stripped the insulation from an extension cord, taped the exposed wire over his heart, and plugged it into a wall socket. The sensitive young man had not been able to shake off the trauma of years of homosexual rape and abuse, after all. Without the star witness, it was useless to prosecute the two foster fathers and the Parkway home employee. However, although they were not criminally prosecuted, the foster parent licenses of the two foster fathers were removed, and the Parkway employee was fired. It was a small price to pay for a boy's life. Scotty's death was evidence to Raymondo of the dangers to young people from homosexuals. He is convinced that a nationwide crime network exists to feed the demands of chicken hawks for young boys. Sometimes the youngsters are sent halfway around the world to provide sex for a wealthy pederast. Probing Bradford's background, Raymondo said, he turned up information about a boy who was about to be flown to the Philippines for a weekend of sex. Travel, hotel accommodations, and the fee for the boy were computed at between $3,500 to $4,000. Most people don't want to talk about things like this, not even police officers, Raymondo says, shaking his head in anger. But it comes down to the fact that these guys are ruining kids. They're turning them into homosexuals and thieves, ruining them for the rest of their lives. It's a crime against nature. To me, it's even worse than murder. According to Raymondo, young male hookers often steal credit cards from their customers. Boy prostitution, as does female prostitution, breeds other crimes. In New Orleans, meanwhile, the investigation was expanding. Nearly 20 men were either in police custody or charged and being sought in connection with boy prostitution and pornography. Boys have been located who posed for lewd movies and still photos. It has been like dropping a pebble into water, observed Orleans Parish District Attorney Harry Connick. You think you've got it all, but the ripple ring keeps spreading. The DA noted that some of the defendants had been previously prosecuted in England and in the Philippines for sexually abusing children. In Chicago, where she was attending a convention, Dr. Denson Gerber called a news conference and named New Orleans as part of the multi-city network of pimps and pornographers who were annually exploiting as many as 300,000 boys, some as young as 8 years old. She charged that the youngsters were constantly shuttled among New York City, Los Angeles, Houston, New Orleans, and Chicago. Authorities in New Orleans pointed out that although much of the activity centered around the discredited scout troop, that not all the boys in the organization were involved. It was becoming increasingly apparent also that many boys with no connection with the troop had been lured into the ring's web of unsavory affairs. By that time, Woodall had been charged with 13 counts of unnatural carnal knowledge and was awaiting trial. He was committed for a while to a state mental hospital suffering from severe mental depression and suspected suicidal tendencies. 15 charges were lodged against Richard C. Jacobs, a millionaire from the exclusive Boston suburb of Arlington, Massachusetts, and part owner of the New England Patriots. He was accompanied by 2 lawyers when he surrendered himself to face accusations of engaging in oral and anal sex with scouts from Troop 137. He was officially charged with aggravated crimes against nature, offenses that carried penalties up to 15 years imprisonment on each count. He posted bond, then failed to appear for his scheduled trial. Newspapers reported at that time that he was also being sought in Britain on similar charges. At one time, police believed him to be hiding out in South America and living on a $3 million nest egg. Before the probe was exhausted, it had extended into 34 states. One of the most disturbing aspects of the investigation was the high economic and social standing of many of the adults involved. It was obvious that pedophilia was not a phenomenon related solely to a few dirty old men who hung around parks and bus stations dressed in semen-stained raincoats. The wealth and respectability of the new breed of panderers helped them to deceive lackadaisical social workers and agencies. Government funding and employees were frequently put at their disposal to promote and carry out their schemes. When the New Orleans Scout leaders were arrested, they had already prepared applications for state and federal funding to operate homes for troubled or abandoned boys. As Halverson, Woodall, and Paske had demonstrated, the men who deal in boys and sex know how to worm their way into positions of authority in organizations that work with youngsters. One detective with the Juvenile Division in the New Orleans Police Department pointed out that Troop 137 was taken over by homosexuals who accepted minor positions in the organization and gradually worked their way up to Scoutmaster or Assistant Scoutmaster. He explained that for a while they organized so many camping trips and outings that the fathers of the boys could not keep up with the schedule. When the parents were no longer there to keep an eye on their youngsters, the time was right for the chicken hawks to move in. The situation in New Orleans was not unique in scouting, although it appeared to be better organized than most similar operations. The Boy Scouts of America deal with more than 1 million volunteer leaders, and it is almost impossible to keep a few bad apples from slipping by. The national organization has a file of some 4,000 sex offenders and other undesirables who are blacklisted from scouting programs. But selection of leaders is made by local officials, and it is relatively easy for a determined individual to change locations and identities. Many others who might choose to abuse their positions of trust in an establishment that works with young people may never before have indicated that they were not completely trustworthy. Woodall was never in trouble with the law prior to his arrest in the Troop 137 scandal. His family was respected, and he had a better-than-average education, reasonable earning capacity, and financial status. There was not the slightest blot on his reputation and no reason to believe that he might not make an excellent scoutmaster. The shockwaves from disclosures that the troop had been infiltrated and taken over by chicken hawks were being felt nationally, however. The scouts were already experiencing a declining membership, and the organization was moving as quickly and efficiently as it could to meet the changing needs of the young people of today. The trouble in New Orleans led a spokesman to concede that some 3,000 boys who would normally have been expected to enroll from the area had not joined. He attributed the slowdown in interest to the sex scandal. Horrified Scout leaders quickly cautioned against overreacting and indiscriminately identifying the Scouts with abuses like those that occurred with Troop 137. They cited their organization's long record of service with boys. Spokesman, however, awkwardly conceded that there was already some discomfort in regard to programs for both boys and girls because of sex scandals across the country and the brutal murders of 3 children during a Girl Scout campout in Oklahoma. David Birkeland, director of field services for the Chicago Area Boy Scout Council, talked frankly to Chicago Tribune reporter Michael Sneed about the troubles with adult leaders. Child molestation is an age-old problem, and we have tried our best to keep it from our organization. But bank robbers are attracted to banks like child molesters are attracted to youth agencies, he said. About the time that the activities in Troop 137 came to the attention of authorities, it was learned that a man wanted in New York for child molesting had changed his name and become a leader of different troops in Santa Monica, California. By the time he was arrested in California, he admitted molesting 300 children. He was eventually prosecuted for sexually abusing one of the young scouts under his care in a back room during a troop meeting. In Chicago and in suburban McHenry County, Illinois, some scout leaders were arrested a few days apart and charged with molesting boys. Although they did not display the organizational abilities of the New Orleans group, they were accused of using their positions to seduce scouts and their troops. 26-year-old Patrick A. Weglars, Scoutmaster of Troop 294 in Chicago, and his assistant Scoutmaster, 22-year-old Charles Fugate, were charged with taking indecent liberties with an 11-year-old boy during a camping trip. Several other scouts told police they witnessed the sexual encounters. The troop was sponsored by a Southside church. During their investigation, police learned that Fugate had been convicted previously of contributing to the sexual delinquency of a minor and had been placed under court supervision for a year. Ironically, the troop charter expired prior to the arrest of the pair, and renewal was delayed pending the investigation of drinking and card playing by adult leaders during an earlier outing. Police entered the case when they were called to Fugate's home to break up a fight between him and the father of the victim. The day he returned home, the child had told his father of the incident. The suburban scout leader who got into trouble was Robert C. Sample, a 35-year-old officer of the Woodall Police Department. A leader of Troop 65, he pleaded guilty to contributing to the sexual delinquency of a child after an incident that occurred in a motel during a weekend he spent with the boys at a ski resort. 2 scout leaders in Worcester, Massachusetts, were arrested on charges of rape and other sex offenses after being accused of attacking several boys ranging from 11 to 14 years old. Both men, who lived together, had been scout leaders for 2 years, and one was director of a scheduled show called The Wonderful World of Scouting. A few years earlier, a homosexual ring preying on boys 8 to 16 years old was uncovered in Waukesha, Wisconsin, after the president of the Waukesha Memorial Hospital committed suicide. 2 scout leaders were accused of being members of the gang, and the dead man was publicly identified as a ringleader. Back in Coral Gables, Raymond was intensifying his efforts to locate Bradford and Lang and to follow up new leads. The tenacious policeman obtained old attendance records from the Adelphi school. He found several former students who admitted having sexual relations with Lang. The information, including sworn depositions from the boys, was referred to the state's attorney's office. Equally as promising was information identifying a youngster from the Daytona Beach area who was a favorite of Bradford's. The man and the boy were said to be devoted companions. Raimondo and Spooner talked to the boy and his grandmother. He gave police a sworn statement, 37 typewritten pages of lurid testimony detailing his relationship and sexual dallying with Bradford. He told of orgies, beatings of other boys, nude bathing, experiments with Valium and marijuana, and of submitting to anal intercourse with the former principal. The youth said he first met the man when he was sent to Adelphi. When his adult admirer moved to a new city, the boy was taken along. In fact, the boy related, Bradford was so enamored of him that he continued to telephone every few days. It was an exciting development. It meant that Bradford might yet stumble into their net if he made the mistake of continuing to telephone his young paramour. But if he called, Raimondo and Spooner did not hear about it. They learned from other officers, however, that the name Bradford was an alias for Peter Müller, a naturalized citizen from Europe. Officers were prevented from gathering other helpful information from various governmental agencies and private companies because of restrictions spelled out by the Federal Disclosure Act. A few months later, the Coral Gables policemen learned that Bradford was in Holly Hill, Florida, near Daytona Beach. They notified Volusia County Sheriff's officers, and the suspect was quickly arrested. He was carrying nearly $10,000 in cash and traveler's checks. Bradford waived extradition and was returned to New Orleans to face charges. Bail of $50,000 was established. Bradford posted bail and disappeared. A federal fugitive warrant was issued for his arrest, and authorities in Dade County, Florida, added an indictment on 3 counts of sexual battery to the charges already pending against him in New Orleans. Raimondo and his partner were disappointed, but they were not the type to brood over lost opportunities. Raimondo was especially incensed and anxious to bring all the members of the boy pornography and prostitution cabal to justice. One of his targets was Richard C. Thompson, Jr., publisher of a weekly tabloid, This Week, in Titusville, Florida. When Raimondo first told police there of his suspicions that Thompson was involved in chicken porn, they were dubious. Although Thompson was controversial and no special friend of the police department, he was a respected official in the local Democratic Party and a leader in the community. Officers knew Thompson as the individual who sparked a state investigation of their police chief by mailing copies of newspaper articles to the Florida governor accusing the law enforcement official of fixing traffic tickets. The police chief was subsequently cleared. From almost the first day Thompson arrived in the bustling little community across the Indian River from Cape Kennedy, he had drawn attention to himself. Energetic and gregarious, Thompson was soon appointed chairman of the Titusville Drug Abuse Commission. His tenure ended after 6 weeks when he tangled with the city council over his efforts to expand the commission membership by adding 3 teenagers to the body. He also campaigned spiritedly for the 18-year-old vote. If he sometimes immodestly bragged about his position as the scion of a wealthy family in the East who had added to his inherited fortune with wise investments, and talked proudly of a Ph.D. in psychology he earned at Georgetown University, it was excusable. He obviously enjoyed the recognition of his scholastic achievement, which most of his acquaintances acknowledged when they addressed him as Doc or Dr. Thompson. And he obviously enjoyed his role as crusading newspaper editor, criticizing and picking fights in the columns of This Week with some of the most respected and influential members of the community. True, he was pugnacious and sometimes appeared to be overly anxious to quarrel, but there was no reason to believe that he would take indecent liberties with young boys or deal in pornography. So it was a surprise when Titusville Police Sergeant Ron Clark learned from a background check that Thompson had served more than 2 years in the Florida State Prison for showing obscene movies to minors and 3 months in a federal prison for distributing child pornography through the mail. Other blots on his character and background were also uncovered. His name was not Thompson, but Alan Andrew Parsons. He apparently changed names almost as often as he changed socks. There was no Ph.D. in psychology and no record of his attendance at Georgetown. He was quickly ousted from his seat on the Brevard County Democratic Executive Committee. And as a convicted felon who had not had his civil rights restored, he was charged with illegally registering to vote. Once aware of his true background, Titusville police began probing Thompson's activities with young boys. Drawing on information from Raimondo and Spooner in Coral Gables, and the results of their own investigation, police arrested him on several charges of morals violations, including lewd and lascivious assault on a 13-year-old boy. A search of his home unearthed a stockpile of pornography and paraphernalia. Among the ropes, vibrators, and panties, and obscene photographs, movies, magazines, and books were diaries that recorded sexual encounters with young boys with nude photographs and notations listing specific acts, dates, and payment, according to police. Authorities announced that Thompson was suspected of taking nude photographs of young boys who came to his home and then sexually assaulting them, receiving stolen property, falsifying circulation claims of his newspaper to fraudulently obtain legal advertising from the municipality of Titusville, parole violation, and failure to file income tax returns. Internal Revenue Service spokesmen were quoted as linking him to the publication of Better Life monthly magazines that featured nude shots of youthful males. One of Thompson's favorite tricks, police said, was paying boys to tie his naked body with ropes and then leave him helpless on the floor, as if he were the victim of a robber, until a roommate returned home and freed him. The loquacious Thompson, who was once a champion high school debater from Fort Lauderdale and the first teenager to address the Florida state legislature, fought back. After more than 2 years of trials and other legal maneuvering, he finally was returned to federal prison for violating a special condition of his probation that stipulated that he should not again become involved with pornography. A guilty plea to failure to file income tax returns brought an 18-day sentence, and he drew 60 days in the county jail on a misdemeanor charge of receiving stolen property. He won acquittal on the lewd and lascivious assault charges, but drew a 7-month jail term for tampering with a witness after admitting that he had offered $1,000 to a man to prevent a youth from testifying against him in the trial. There were no other convictions. Circuit Court Judge David U. Strawn ordered all the confiscated pornography, except that showing juveniles, returned to him. The former publisher was entitled to the possession of pornography in his home. It's an American right, the jurist explained. He ordered the child porn destroyed, however, because of its blackmail potential. Thompson did not return to Brevard County to serve his time in the county jail after release from federal prison. Officer Clark was neither surprised nor disappointed. "I'm satisfied as long as he stays away from here," the young detective observed. "I don't care if I ever see him again." Investigations and court actions were being wrapped up in Coral Gables and New Orleans as well. Raymond was nauseated by Scotty Baker's death, and he pressed his campaign against chicken hawks more determinedly than ever. He provided information that led to moral charges against a prominent attorney, a former judge, and another Dade County official. And though it was outside his jurisdiction, he gathered evidence that helped expose a gay Catholic priest acting as a youth counselor in the Miami area. 22 men rounded up in the wide-ranging investigation were eventually convicted and sentenced for sex offenses involving children. 17 were involved in offenses directly linked to New Orleans and Coral Gables conspiracies. Woodall was the first to be sentenced, drawing prison terms totaling 75 years after conviction on 11 counts of crimes against nature involving scouts from Troop 137. One of the boys was 9 years old. District Attorney Connick remarked that the sentence was most appropriate and realistic. He added that harsh sentences, such as Woodall's, could drive people like this out of the community. Orleans Parish Criminal District Court Judge Oliver P. Schulenkamp remarked in a 5-page statement that the facts show that the defendant, Raymond Thomas Woodall, cunningly exploited the naivete, ignorance, and/or situational status of the respective parents of the victims. He took advantage of and used for his own unlawful, lustful, and contorted purposes a great, useful, and wholesome American institution, namely the Boy Scouts of America. The former scoutmaster was denounced for damaging the reputation of the Scouts and for being responsible for an undeserved blotch on the record of a fine organization which serves high human purposes. The judge said that, in returning the harsh sentence, he was considering the repulsive nature of the crime and the potential damage done to the young victims. Indeed, it is likely a trauma and a stigma which will haunt the young victims throughout the course of their lives and probably to their graves. The angry jurist pointed out that families shared the psychic trauma with the boys. Halverson, Cramer, Lang, and Paske were also convicted, along with about a dozen other defendants. The men were sentenced to 2,640 years of penitentiary time. Other convictions were returned in cities across the country. The work of the detectives from Coral Gables, Titusville, and New Orleans had been done well. Even Scotty Baker's death was not without meaning. His suicide, and the hideous burning of a 16-year-old foster child drenched with gasoline and set afire outside his Opelika home at about the same time, sparked a sweeping investigation in Dade County of the sexual and other abuse of children in state-licensed homes. Vernon Swain survived the burns inflicted by two other boys who claimed their foster father had instructed them to set the victim on fire for misbehavior. The boy's guardian was acquitted of a charge of attempted murder, but lost his license as a foster parent after an investigation disclosed that he had a long arrest record.